In this video, we will be showing you how to install the batch kit. For this installation, we will be mounting the solar panels on an angle adjustable roof mounting system. We will begin by showing you how to install the mounting system and wire the solar panels. Included in the mounting system is 3 front feet and 3 angle adjustable back feet, which we will attach to the rafters or purlins through the roof. There are 4 rails, which we will use a rail splice to connect 2 rails together to form the front and back rail, 4 end clamps and 4 mid clamps, which will be used to attach the panels to the rails. Before we begin installation, it is important to plan out where on the roof you'll be installing the panels. The front and back rails are 4.2 meters long and require a foot at each end and 1 foot in the middle. The distance between the front feet and the back feet should be between 1,250 mm and 1,400 mm. The next step is to wire up the electronic side. For this step, you'll want to have your charge controller, inverter, circuit breakers, and circuit breaker enclosure at the ready.
You want to look for the purlins or the rafters that run along your roof. You can spot these by the nails, the roofing screws that go in a straight line across your roof like these ones here. So when you mount these up, for this style of roof, on this style of foot, what you want to do is you want to be using this center screw hole here. These also come with these silicone pads that you want to be putting between the roof and the mount, just to make sure the roof stays watertight. Put this in line between these screws, and then you use the roofing screws that are included with the kit. These are self-tapping, so they just go straight in through the roof and down into the rafter or purlin that runs along the screw line. So for this kit, there's 3 of these included. You want 1 on either end of the rail length and 1 in the center. To join the 2 rails together, what you want to do is have the 2 rails butted together with this long section, this wide section facing upwards. So make sure when you have the rails together that they are both orientated the same way, so everything, the same profile, follows through both rails. So what we're going to do is we're going to slip this rail splice into one side of the rail and then slip the other rail onto the rail splice. Make sure the rail splice has an equal amount of space on each side of both rails. The next thing we want to do is get a 6mm Allen and tighten down those bolts. When you install these on your roof, you want to make sure that the bolt head is facing outwards when you put the rail on. You also want the rail so that this corrugation here is facing upwards. So when you clamp these together, that this rail, the corrugations here, match the corrugations on this clamp of the leg. So to attach the legs to the rail, what I've done is taken this clamp piece off the leg just to show you. So what you want to do is this little clamp piece here, you want to hook it in to the rail. You want to slide it in, so it clamps in like this, and then you want to line this up with the corrugations on the rail and the clamp, and then tighten this down. So when you install these back legs here, you want to make sure the distance between these and the front ones are between 1250 millimeters and 1400 millimeters. You also want to install them facing the same way, so the threaded part of the foot is facing the same way as the front, and this right angle bit is facing the same way as the threaded side. You want the rail to be facing the same way as the front, with this corrugated side facing towards this clamping piece here. We've now got one panel just sitting up here, and the first mounts you want to put on are these end mounts. You can see that they look like a Z. So just to put these on, you can slide these in here and tighten it down here. And this bolt again is a 6mm Allen. These T-style clamps are the clamps that go in between the panels, just like these ones here. To get them in, you want to make sure that the bolt is flush with the bottom of this clamping piece. And then you just put it in, and they slide in just like that. You put it up against here, you slide the next panel in, and then you clamp the 2 panels down together. Once you have all the panels mounted, and you have the angle adjusted to what you want, it's time to go around and tighten up all the bolts. You want to make sure all of these bolts that hold the legs are tight, and there's also a locking nut on each side, on the same side as the thread on the foot. You want to go around and make sure all of those are tight so nothing can move. and you want to make sure all the clamps across the top of the back legs are tight as well. So now we want to wire up these panels together. Now for the batch kit, what we want to do is we want 2 panels in series, and then these 2 panels in series, and then we want to join those 2 series arrays of panels together. We want to run it to our cable run. Now to do that, you want to go to these 2 panels here. You want to connect the positive to the negative between these 2 panels here. And you want to go down to between these 2 panels here. And you want to do the same thing, connecting the positive to the negative. Now, to connect between these 2 panels, you want to be using the Y branch connectors. So the Y branch looks like this, and you want to take the positive from this panel and the positive from the 3rd panel along and connect them together. You want to then cable tie this up so it's out of the way. You also want to take this Y branch connector and do the same thing, connecting the negative of this panel here to the negative of the panel last on the row. So now we've got these panels wired together with 2 of them in series, and then those 2 series arrays in parallel. You should have 1 positive connection coming out like this, and on the other side down here you'll have 1 negative connection coming out. So our cables that come with the kit are pre-crimped. So the red one will have this connector on it, and we'll plug into the positive connector down here. One thing to be wary of, before you plug this in, you want to make sure on the other end of this cable run, the cables are properly terminated into the circuit breaker before you plug this in. As soon as you plug these cables into the panel array, they will become live, so you want to make sure that there's no possibility of these cables at the other end being short-circuited. Now that we've got our solar panel cable run, what we need to do is get all the equipment set up, and we need to run our cable that goes from the circuit breakers down to the battery, and from all the circuit breakers to our charge controller and inverter. I like to start by laying all the equipment out first, and we want to make sure all the circuit breakers are switched off. And another thing I do to make this easier is I drill holes that line up with the terminals in the circuit breaker in this back plate of the circuit breaker enclosure. So the first step is I'm going to take off the front cover. Be careful not to lose the screws to put the cover back on. So we've got our solar panel cable run down through here. What we want to do is we want to terminate this into this circuit breaker here. So what we're going to do is we're going to measure the correct length out here, and then we're going to cut these down. So we're going to leave just a little bit extra on here, just so we can route it nicely. Now, before you strip these, you want to make sure that these are not connected to the solar panels. You don't want these to be plugged into the solar panels when you're working with them, as when they're plugged into the solar panels, these cables are going to be live. So we're just going to strip about 1 centimetre off the end of both of these cables. And we're going to terminate this into this circuit breaker here. Now when you screw these into the circuit breaker, you want to be making sure that you're definitely getting these in the right place, right between the clamp for the circuit breaker. Now you want to make sure these are nice and tight when you're tightening up the cables in the clamp, because if any of the connections are loose, they can get even more loose over time and cause a high resistance part in the circuit, which will give you a less efficient system and may cause things to get too hot. So we will have some cable left over from our solar panel run, and we'll use this cable to connect from the circuit breaker up into the charge controller on the solar panel side. So what you want to do is you want to find out roughly the right length that you're going to need, and then you want to cut that off. So now that we've got a runner cable that's going to be roughly right, we just want to strip the ends off this. Now when you clamp these down and screw these terminals down, you want to make sure that the metal contacts inside these terminals are contacting with the core of the wire, the copper core of the wire. You don't want to be clamping down on the insulation of the cable, because while it might work and you might get a connection, it's never going to be a strong connection and it's only going to cause you trouble. So now we've got the solar cable run, we're going to start on the cable that runs through to the battery. Now included in our kits are 16mm cable, which comes pre-crimped with terminals that screw straight onto the battery terminals. And we use the 16mm, the thinner cable of the two, to run from the charge controller into the circuit breaker, from the circuit breaker down to our battery bank. So to make sure we get this cable tidy as possible, I like to screw down the positive side first, and then we make our cable run up to the circuit breaker. Now, you want to make sure you've got enough cable to go all the way into the charge controller, because we're going to use this cable to make the run from here into here as well. So now we've got our positive run that goes into this circuit breaker, and then we want to do positive run from the circuit breaker into the charge controller. Making sure that while we're working on this, all the circuit breakers are in the down position, which is in the off position. The circuit breaker that we use for the solar panels, this one here is the 25 amp circuit breaker. This one next to it that we're doing from the charge controller to the batteries, to charge the batteries, this one is a 63 amp. And the one that's going to run between the batteries and our inverter is 125 amp. Now just doing this one, we're going to do the same thing as before, just making sure we get the right length on this. When you're putting these cables in, you want to make sure that these are fully unscrewed, which means the clamp is in the furthest down position, which means it's going to be the easiest to get the cable between the clamp. Again, making sure that we're clamping on the conductor of the cable and not the insulation. Alright, that's our positive run done. We're just going to do the same thing for the negative. Taking our negative cable and attaching it to the negative of the battery on the other side of the battery bank. Again, making sure that we've still got enough to run to the charge controller. So now that we've got this last negative run finished, the wiring to this charge controller is complete. The last thing to do is tighten down these two screws here to clamp these cables down, just to give them some extra strain relief, and then we'll put the front case back on. So the last cable run we have to do is with the 25mm cable. And we're going to do the same thing again, where we clamp the positive down on this side, we follow the same cable up, or we run it into the 125 amp circuit breaker, and then we make sure to leave the extra that we need to run from the other side of the 125 amp breaker, down to the positive and negative of our inverter. When you're clamping in this larger 125 amp gauge, you want to make sure that you really tighten down the screw and that this cable is completely secure in the circuit breaker. As this is carrying a high current, you don't want this connection to be loose at all, because if there's any high resistance in this connection, it can generate a lot of heat and either damage the circuit breaker, damage the cable, or damage the inverter. So when you're clamping this cable down into the circuit breaker and the inverter, you want to make sure that you get it as tight as you can. These bolts on the inverter are a 17mm bolt, and you want to make sure to get these nice and tight. Now with a 17mm spanner you have a lot of leverage, so you don't want to go too hard on it, but something like that is about tight enough. Again, making sure that you're clamping on the conductor of the cable and you're not getting any of the insulator. Now that we've got all our cables run and we've got all the lengths correct, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and just clean all this up and tidy this up so these cable runs are nice and tidy. Now that we've gotten all these cables tidied away and we've got everything looking good, we can do one final check to make sure all of these are tight. Make sure they're definitely tight and the clamps are clamping down on the conductor and not the insulator, and we can put this case back on. The next step is to connect all of these batteries together. You want to make sure that all these connections are tight before we switch anything on. So we're going to run through now and we're going to loop these battery connectors between the negative to the positive, negative to positive, negative to positive between here. Once you have all these connectors loosely bolted down, you want to run through and make sure all of them are tight. Now be careful if you're using something like a socket wrench, because you can get a lot of leverage on these and you can strip out the threads in the battery. So you're going to make sure they're tight, but you don't want to go too hard and strip out the threads in the battery. Now that we have this side completely wired up, what we can do is we can go back to our solar panels, finish plugging them in, and then we can boot everything up. So we've got everything wired up inside. Last thing we need to do is connect up our panels. So we're going to be running this positive lead through here and into this Y branch here. Now when you're plugging these in, you want to make sure that the circuit breaker on the other side is turned off. You don't want to be connecting MC4 connectors while there is load on the panels. So definitely make sure that that circuit breaker is in the down position, switched off. Now the last thing to do is to tidy these cables up. So we'll cable tie these up here, out of the way, and then we'll go switch the system on. Alright, we've just got our panels all connected up. We've got them all tidied away, cable run, and now the last thing we need to do is switch everything on. So what I like to do is I like to switch on the 63 amp first in the middle, which connects the charge controller to the battery. I like to wait for that to boot up, make sure everything's good. So this charge controller, once you connect it, it takes a little while to boot up, just as it's auto-detecting battery voltage and everything. Now we see our charge controller has fully booted, and if we just see there, the batteries are at 51.4 volts. So these batteries haven't been used, so they've still got quite a bit of charge in them just from how they've been sitting. But we'll turn the panels on now, and we should see the charge controller switch from night mode, and we've got everything charging now. You see the flashing light symbolising that the panels are working correctly and the charge controller is charging the batteries. Alright, the last thing we can do is switch on the inverter and double check here. We can see that all of the 3 lights on the side here are showing green. So this inverter here has a standard wall outlet plug on it. So what we can do is we can plug in a multi-board here, and we can run a few devices off this inverter just on a multi-board, just to get us by until we can get an electrician to wire this into the main distribution board if you're going to have internal wiring in your cabin or tiny house.